Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 122 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today's reading and commentary primarily covers 2 Samuel chapter 24. Now, this is a chapter that, in so many ways, it is a difficult chapter. It's a chapter that starts off with David's pride and complete rebellion against God. I know that it's, when we look at David's sin at this point, some would think, well, certainly his sin with Bathsheba, the sin of adultery, and then the sin of having her husband killed, murdered in many ways, in battle is greater than this. But in many ways, it is not. Because David, when he confesses his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah the Hittite, he says, I have sinned. But when he confesses to this, it is, I have sinned greatly. So what exactly is the great sin here? So David has, for some reason, he has decided, I want to take a census. And it's really felt like this is an issue of pride. It's to say, look at how I have grown the nation. Look at how we are now prosperous. Look at where we are. And here's something to consider. You know, it's like David is basically saying, I have all of this. I own this. You know, you might have money in your bank account and you would count that money. But if you were to go over and open your neighbor's mailbox and pull out your neighbor's bank statement and start looking at his account, that would not be appropriate because it's not yours. And this is, in a brief explanation, why it's not appropriate for David to count the people. In times past, when the census was taken in the book of Numbers, and Moses was told by God to count the people at the beginning of the book of Numbers and then at the end of the book of Numbers, this was God having Moses count God's people. Not Moses' people, but God's people. And the nation, the people of Israel, are God's. They belong unto Him. All of us belong unto the Lord. And this was the principle for the census taken in the book of Numbers, and it is not something which David was to take upon himself unless the Lord had instructed him to do it. And this is why we're shown in 1 Chronicles, the comparing chapter of this, that it was Satan. It says Satan stood up against Israel. And it was Satan who provoked David to take the census. David didn't have to do it. When it says Satan provoked him, David should have checked himself. And we're going to see Joab, he even tries to get David to realize this is not something to do. It's interesting where Joab, who was at times quick to kind of take matters into his own hands, he still had a great fear of the Lord. He knew that the battles that they won came through the power of God. As the general of Israel, he knew so many times when they would go out to battle that they were far outnumbered. And Joab realized that their victories only came from God. And this is why I say Joab, to me, sometimes seems like an interesting character. And I could associate with him where he goes out and suddenly it's like, you know, Saul's no longer the king and Saul's son is trying to rule. We're going to put an end to him. And, you know, he takes some matters into his own hands. Like when he goes out with his men and they find Absalom hanging in the tree. They don't let Absalom down. Now, his direct orders from David was, don't harm my son. But he knew Absalom would just rise up again. He would create another problem again. And it's not saying that he was Spirit-led in that action, but he has a heart that he wants to do what's right, it seems, even though at times it meant going against David's wishes. Joab really cautions David, and David continues in this action. God pretty much gives David 10 months to correct himself, and yet he persists in this counting of the people. As I say, it's really this difficult time in David's life. David, who is a man after God's own heart, this is one point where he directly turns and goes against God's will. And as I say, I realize it's a little difficult to for man, especially the way that we think, to say, well, this was a greater sin than his adultery or his murder. But it is, because this is so direct against God. It's, as I say, it's like going and opening up your neighbor's mailbox and saying, well, I want to see how much he has. Because it was God's people, God's army that David was counting, not his. It didn't belong to him. The people didn't belong to David. David was just the one who God had put there really as a steward. It would have almost been better if, rather than the kings of Israel being called kings, if they had been called the steward, God's steward over the people. And in many ways, that's what, before, when the people cried out to Samuel, we want a king, under the judges they had that steward, really, that oversaw the people. The last part of this chapter is where David is going to go and buy the threshing floor where the temple will ultimately be built. He has his own encounter on Mount Moriah with an angel. And it's very similar, isn't it, to the encounter which Abraham has on Mount Moriah. Remember that this is the very mountain which God showed Abraham to take Isaac to. The very mountain that they walked up after a 3-day journey. They went to the top of the mountain. Isaac said, well, Father, here's fire, here's wood, but where's the sacrifice? And Abraham said, God will provide. And now, David stands at that same spot, having built an altar to the Lord, offering up sacrifice. And when the angel of death sees this sacrifice, he holds back. 70,000 people. Think of that number. 70,000 people die because of David's disobedience. And when it said of the blood that David had shed was what's going to keep him from building the temple, and this is going to be a charge that will go to his son Solomon, I really believe that this is because of that blood of the 70,000 that die of a plague. And it's interesting too that God gives David the choice. He says, I can either bring a famine, or I can send an army, or I can send a plague. It's like behind curtain number 1, number 2, or number 3. You choose. The famine would really only affect the poor in many ways. The rich always have a way of basically making it through a difficult time and a famine. I think of Naomi and her husband when they flee Bethlehem during the famine. They had money. Now death would come, of course, to Naomi's husband and her 2 sons, but they had a way of fleeing the famine and went to the land of Moab. And then you think of then the army that would come. Still, that wouldn't necessarily affect all classes of people. Even David wouldn't have gone to battle at that point because of his age. But the plague could touch anybody the rich, the poor, those who dwelt in the cities, even those who were in the palace, would be affected by a plague. 70,000 people. And I know some would have a difficult time saying, well, who, but what are these people? I can't answer that. Those things are in God's hands as to who died or why that person. But it's because of David's disobedience. And it's because of that bloodshed, because of that disobedience, because of David having had Uriah the Hittite killed, that now he will not be the one to build the temple, but it will go to his son Solomon. David's going to purchase the threshing floor on Mount Moriah. It could have been given to him, but he says, no, it must be purchased. And it's really a sacrifice to have even purchased it. Where it could have been given, it's a sacrifice. It's really that step of obedience. Now, I want to end with this today because there's sometimes a little discrepancy here, and I'm going to share a part of my opinion and why I believe that. I know today when we see the Temple Mount, we see the Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim shrine basically that's been built on the Temple Mount. And under the Dome of the Rock there's a piece of bedrock that is a natural stone from that threshing floor in a sense. And people think, well, when the third temple is built, the Dome of the Rock must not be there anymore, or maybe they're going to destroy it, or something will happen to allow the temple of God to be built there. Now, I do want to say, because sometimes I see Christians get caught up in the third temple being rebuilt, be careful, because when the third temple is built, it is ultimately not a temple unto God, but will be the temple which the Antichrist will speak from. So when Christians send money to organizations like Temple Mount Faithful, you're sending money ultimately for a false temple and a false system of worship to be established again in Israel. This is not even the temple to the God of the Jews, who is our God, but it's not a Jewish temple ultimately. This is going to be the temple that the Antichrist will speak from, the temple that he will be worshipped in, the temple that his image will be set up in. But how does that place come about? And I just have a little sketch here. If you pull up a picture of the Temple Mount, you will notice that off to the side of the Dome of the Rock, there's a little gazebo that's off to the side of it. And that gazebo also covers a part of natural bedrock. And it is a flattened piece of bedrock, smoothed out. That seems like that would have been more of the threshing floor. Because the rock which is under the Dome of the Rock is a rough hewn rock, not a place that you could spread out grain and let the wind blow the chaff away. It's not a practical place or spot for that. But the rock that's under this dome, which for a long time, for hundreds of years, was referred to as the dome of the breath of God, it sits off to the side. Now, here's, as I say, this is just a brief little sketch here of what that placement would look like if a third temple was constructed. Here's the Dome of the Rock, which would be number 6 on my little drawing. But at number 4, you see this is the eastern gate. So if you were to technically draw a line from the eastern gate straight back in this little circle here, which would have been the placement of the Holy of Holies, if you were to draw a straight line from the eastern gate back through that location, you would divide that rock underneath that little dome, that little gazebo. You divide it in half. Do you think that is where the temple of God stood? I do. I think that you could literally go to sleep tonight and wake up in the morning, and it doesn't have to be a stone structure that's built there. It could be a tabernacle erected. So I don't want to get too caught up into that, but I want you to see the events that we're studying and reading where David purchases this threshing floor, purchases this property where the temple of God would ultimately be built. A third temple could be built there at some point. We know from Scripture that it will. It's a matter of time and the Lord's timing. I don't know when it'll be built. No one knows, because it aligns with the end of times, which only God knows. Well, brothers and sisters, as we wrap up the books of Samuel, we're preparing to enter into a new portion of our reading. And again, I always say this is a wonderful time to invite others to join us in this daily commentary and reading as well. I hope that your day is going well. Until tomorrow, God bless.